¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hello everyone and welcome back to part 2 of Quiet Riot's Poll the Other One Christmas special. If you've not yet listened to part 1 with Luke Trill of More in Common, go back, have a listen to that, then dive into this one. And in this episode, I'm going to be speaking to James Kanagasooriam. He's Chief Research Officer at Focaldata, which is a great polling company. They do MRP, they do really interesting things with AI to gauge public opinion. And I can't wait to hear what he's going to be telling us, especially about global trends, because Focaldata work all around the world, not just in the Anglosphere, but I think he's going to have some particularly interesting nuggets for us about what happened in the USA and what might be coming down the line in the year that is about to be upon us. So I hope you enjoy it, have a listen, and I'll be back at the end with a wrap up. James Kanagasooriam, Chief Research Officer at Focaldata and good friend. James, welcome to your Quiet Riot debut.
Oh, thank you, Naomi. Thanks for having me on.
How's the festive season treating you so far?
Very well, and well usually means quite tiring. So balancing and work and leisure and trying to work out what the difference is between the two. But yeah, no, we're all good here.
Everything in moderation, including moderation, huh?
Exactly.
Well, listeners, you may not know, but James coined the famous, is it infamous, is it notorious, but certainly very, very well-known phrase, the red wall. And James, I want to know, do you feel pressure, having done that, to be constantly coming up with the next bit of political polling nomenclature or next voter tribe or geographical descriptor? Once you've become so well known for such an incredible phrase, do you feel like, oh my God, I've got to do the next one?
I mean, to be honest, the answer is no. I've tended to not talk about it all that much, and it was a phrase and a piece of analysis, I think, like the identification of 46 seats. And for me, the phraseology was very much secondary to the analysis. And it was interesting that it kind of took off. But, principally not really. I don't feel that kind of pressure because, marketing, branding is not hugely my game. I tend to just look at polls and try, not just the data, but the story, but also the long-term trends.
Yeah.
And you can't have long-term trends every week.
No.
It'd just be commentary. So I'm kind of quite relaxed about that. I also think that the red wall, and I guess the history of it was very much specifically about a group of people in a place with certain common characteristics. Whereas I think other things have come to the fore in terms of British politics, but also politics everywhere, that is not about just a tiny discrete group, but about these much more structural, big kind of sweep of trends that aren't about people so specifically, but about much bigger things.
Well, we're going to get into those, James. We'll get into those.
Exactly. So yes, there isn't a wall every time, in 2024, I guess, we had that election. And for me, that was very much about, look, there are 4 or 5 interesting things going on, and there isn't a catchy name for all of them. So I'm just going to run through them all, and they're all quite dry.
Yeah.
And you didn't feel necessarily the need, but I did, I guess, kind of forecast that Starmer would likely win a massive majority on a small vote share, and said that reminded me of a sandcastle.
Oh, yeah.
It's a sandcastle majority, one that looks strong, but is effectively probably quite weak. And in a way, that my 2024 analysis was probably more difficult, but in a way is probably held up even better than the 2019 in the UK. But sometimes you get stuff wrong as well. And we're going to talk about that on this podcast as well, I think. For me, 2024 analyses weren't catchy, but in many ways they were far more detailed and more accurate. And I was kind of happier with those. And no one wants to be known for a phrase, if I'm being hugely honest as well.
I know. Well, we've had Stevenage woman and Mondeo man, and like
I
every
mean,
election seems to bring some new soundbite that isn't necessarily particularly meaningful. So let's get on with the deep dive into the polling industry. You touched on it a little bit, but if we look back on 2024, it really wasn't just the UK. Millions and millions and millions of people went out to vote around the world. And I know that Focaldata do a lot of work globally.
mm.
And so I was wondering, from your perspective, are there universal trends in public attitudes that we saw over the last year that are kind of, global trends rather than the very specific ones we might be seeing in the UK?
For me, there are kind of three things that stuck out this year. And I think one of them has had a lot of coverage, which people call about the curse of incumbency, basically. So in general, incumbent governments have been turfed out. It kind of doesn't matter if they're left wing or right wing, conservative or social democrat or socialist. They've all had a really tough time. And that is largely a function of the difficulty of managing the finances and inflation in a post-COVID era. So obviously a lot of governments needed to spend money to keep people's livelihoods afloat, but obviously that's come at quite a large kind of financial cost, and now we're seeing that cost. It's the kind of the opposite in a way, Naomi, of all the premium that a lot of governments had during COVID, where voters were quite thankful for what governments were doing, stepping in, intervening, providing
Yeah.
clear kind of
Yeah.
clarity and direction. It was interesting, you had Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. You also had your great friend Boris Johnson in the UK. All of these guys had very high vote shares, and the people that had elections during that period were able to get a massive electoral dividend. Now we're kind of seeing the opposite. So that would be the very obvious thing
Like
that's
almost a
cropped
correction,
up.
do you think?
Yeah, it's a reversion to like the mean, basically, in that regard. The Harris loss to Trump has to be seen through the prism of dissatisfaction with incumbent governments. We've seen it US, UK, but even in the UK, you saw it in Scotland as well. And you're seeing it with Welsh Labour as well. It's quite interesting. Three different governments within the UK, three different parties, all having difficulties, which for me is quite interesting. And it's a good indication. It's maybe not necessarily about the type of governance. It's just something really structural and systemic. The second, for me, really interesting trend that I would say I'd isolate just to the English-speaking countries, actually, is this trend that it's got a terrible term because I guess no one's thought of something more catchy. They called it race depolarisation, which sounds terrible. Basically, this idea that voters in Western democracies who are not white are beginning to kind of fragment politically, whereas previously they might have vast majority of them voted for progressive parties. We're seeing that across Western democracies, they're actually fragmenting. So they're not necessarily all shifting to the right, but they're all kind of becoming a lot more politically diverse. This was very much the case in the US, and we can talk about that. It's been commented on a lot, I think, and rightly
And
so.
you've
But
done a lot of work in that space, haven't you, about race as an
yeah,
identifier? And
I think I have, just because it's a polling quirk across Western democracies the last 15 years that people who are not white vote almost unilaterally for the left. It never really made demographic or attitudinal sense, if that makes sense. In other words, people's voting intention was not fully lining up with their views, their values, how they saw themselves, what they wanted out of life. And generally, when you have that decoupling, eventually something comes to a head. And eventually people self-sort more along their lines of their actual values.
well, I was going to ask you a follow up on that then, because the Labour Party here in the UK very much founded and rooted in class interest.
Mm.
And is that posing now a much more existential problem for them in a less classist world where people aren't so tethered to their notion of being working class or upper class or anything in between?
I wouldn't just put it to Labour. I think in the UK, every political party seems to be slightly further away from its core mission than it was 30 years ago, which is leading to a bit of kind of confusion at the meta level in our politics. So let's take the Liberal Democrats, for example, and then I'll come to Labour, then I'll come to the Conservatives. The Liberal Democrats, on the label it says Liberal, but ostensibly now it's just a vote broadly amongst the most affluent in semi-urban areas the Lib Dem vote just follows a train line out of London, basically.
Down the M4 corridor.
Exactly. Is it liberal? Not massively convinced. It has a very clear sense of identity and core mission, but it seems quite far away from what it was. And it's quite interesting that the more heterodox characters of the liberal past are a bit more adjunct to basically the core liberal democrat identity of basically quite affluent professionals who are socially liberal but kind of fiscally quite centrist. The Labour Party also has that, founded for working people, but like every other social democratic party, has shed lots of working class votes over the past 30, 40 years. And it was really it was Thomas Piketty, the centre-left economist, who flagged this for years. He was saying, there's a big realignment going on. And they picked up lots of professionals and affluent voters. And then you got the Conservatives as well, who I guess the party of capital and business, but yet has definitely in the past 14 years moved away from that kind of core mission. And so it's really strange. We basically have a load of parties who are quite far away from what their original core found. And I think across the West, this is a bit of an issue because it's quite strange, isn't it? No one seems to do what they say on the tin.
And leading to even more distrust in the political class and a plague on all your houses kind of attitude from a lot of voters. We had Matthew McGregor on our immediate show post the Trump victory in November.
Yeah.
And he recalled being out with the Obama campaign for Obama's second election, speaking to a voter who had voted Obama in 2008, but now wasn't, who said, 10 years ago, I owned my own house, I had a good job, and I was able to potentially one day send both of my children to college. I've lost my home because of the financial crash. I've lost my job, and I definitely can't afford to send either of my children to college. And I'm going to keep sacking whoever is in charge until I get that life back. So there was nothing sort of ideological in the sense of left and right, but it was totally about my life isn't good now, and whoever's in charge is going to be to blame for that until someone sorts it out. And I wonder if that was such a portent of what was coming down the tracks for governments across the West over the subsequent 14 years.
100%. So what you've described, which is this kind of perma-pessimism that's struck the world, struck incumbents, it damaged the last Conservative government. It's clearly damaging the current Labour government. This is not really about politics. This is about delivery. I don't know. I must spend my free time a bit differently to other people. So last year I was reading a really interesting academic paper out of Harvard about something called zero-sum thinking. So that, the idea that if you do well, Naomi, I do badly. If I do well, you do badly, right?
The pie is only so big and you can't ever make a bigger pie.
Exactly. Or Gore Vidal had that famous phrase, every time one of my friends does well, a little bit of me dies. It's kind of that, but made manifest in the society. And I think what these guys were saying, a group of academics, there was about 8 of them, were basically positing that zero-sum thinking is alive and well across most Western democracies, but actually that what it manifests is left-wing and right-wing populism. So on the right, that will be about certain attitudes towards immigration, towards about borders. On the left, about redistribution, about potentially nationalising things. It's all about here is a scarce, wealth is a scarce resource and needs to be protected. And therefore, there needs to be a very clear sense of an in-group and an out-group. And I think for me, what was very interesting, so they didn't make a political judgment, which first of all is a green flag for a paper. But for me, the thing that was really interesting about it was basically they proved as much as you can academically that zero-sum thinking, which is behind all this unrest that continues all across the world, is a function of the GDP, and this is where we get really catchy, Naomi, for a podcast, I'm going to say it slowly, the lagged GDP per capita, i.e. wealth, growth, over the period of your life from the age of your birth to 20. In other words, you can estimate across different countries and at different age cohorts how zero-sum groups of people are by basically the growth of the area. And you think it's not just about growth, it's about that sense of optimism that life is going to get better. It's a very powerful tool, optimism, but people don't think that the opposite is also powerful, pessimism. the sense that everything is irrevocably going to get worse. And for me, that's really powerful, because basically voters are not necessarily saying we're socialist or we're right wing. I think what they're saying is, guys, the people whose hands have been on the steering wheel basically haven't grown the economy for 2-3 decades. It kind of doesn't matter who's in charge. European economic growth has been really sclerotic. It hasn't really worked. You know, the number of like startups that haven't really scaled in Europe is a catastrophe. I think 3 years ago I went to a talk and everyone was talking about Wirecard in Germany. I'm pretty sure that's now bankrupt, and that like they've been
Or
like,
even when there has been growth, it hasn't been redistributed to have an effect on the lives of ordinary people. You know, it doesn't matter if the FTSE 100 climbs 10 points. It does matter if your weekly shop has now, you know, doubled in price.
there's the redistribution element of it. But like, you know, what I would say is that fundamentally the FTSE hasn't grown. I mean, you know, fundamentally, if you put
No,
money
but
into,
if you take the
yeah,
US, that's
yeah, that
probably
hasn't, yeah,
the
yeah.
example where, comparative to Europe, they have seen growth, but that growth hasn't reached the people who decided that the Biden administration and all who sailed with him, aka Kamala Harris, were to blame. And, you know, let's give Trump a go, because at least when he was there, I might not agree with anything he says and does, I felt better off.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think basically incumbent governments, it's someone thought of the term deliverism, which might be terrible. It sounds like a rival to Deliveroo. But basically people now know, kind of irrespective of their ideology, that at the end of their 5 years or 4 years or whatever their term is, they basically have to have grown the economy, and they have to have got past this era of completely slow growth. And for me, that's the kind of the ball game. This whole doom loop of incumbent governments getting elected in on a wave of optimism and then basically getting trashed very quickly and then it changing. None of this is going to stop until European politicians in particular can just say, right, our mandate is for growth. And I often put it to people, you know, we've got a net zero target for climate change. What about the one for growth? Like, where's that prioritization been across all European countries and growth? So for me, the zero-sum thinking was a really interesting trend that came out of this year in terms of where we think politics might go next. And I think the third is a really cheery post-Christmas podcast. I did think of it. It wasn't a term. It was a thing I thought was going on that needed a name. And I called it culture-nomics, which nobody knows how to spell it. So it's never going to catch on. It's basically a lot of cultural issues are now fusing with economic ones.
Go on, explain. Give us an example.
Say there's an issue over access and hiring. Like, what are your policies? How do you do it? That is an issue over social justice and representation. It's very clearly also an economic issue. And increasingly, the issues that really get the public going are ones that are like half cultural and half economic, and they kind of dovetail. So we're not in an era where it's not like going back to the opening of the UK coalition, where the thing that the public were most concerned about was the economy and what's going to happen to the debt, what's going to happen to the deficit. Welfare was a very important political issue back then. It's also not like we're in the 20 post-Brexit years where it's just about immigration, although that is now very important to voters again. It's almost like some issues have like interlocked and intertwined to create this kind of new category of issue, which I've called culture-nomics, which is like what happens when there is an issue on social identity that interacts with some kind of aspect of like economic justice or fairness, and it produces this kind of supercharged super issue.
And surely isn't divorced at all from the phrase you used earlier about the zero sum politics.
No, I
Kind of,
think it's very much linked to it,
right,
which is like
like
it's about
immigration, we
fairness.
have to get it down because there aren't enough homes for people who were born here.
It's exactly
But
that.
then how are you going to build those homes when the construction sector has got huge number of vacancies, is totally
Yeah.
struggling to recruit, has been for over a decade, and you've yet got this enormous housing target to deliver it. So they are incredibly intertwined with growth, with that agenda to deliver for people. But at the same time, I've seen that Farage and Reform UK are already running ads saying these housing targets, if met, will just be given to immigrants.
Well, yeah, I guess that would be another aspect of culturenomics.
Over the last 16 years,
The Subaru Share the Love event has supported charities like the ASPCA, Make-A-Wish, Meals on Wheels America, and the National Park Foundation. When you buy or lease a new Subaru from now until January 2nd, Subaru and its retailers will donate a minimum of $300 to charity. Support a great cause today at Subaru.com/share.
To be a bit more cheery,
Please.
'cause-
Come on,
so,
James, cheer us all
so
up.
we've done fused economic culture, we've done zero sum thinking, and nobody wants anyone else to do well. So it's been a real sack of coal from Santa this year in the realm of public opinion. I guess the other thing that's kind of cropped up for me is the rise of celebrities getting more and more impactful in British politics. Like, we've always had them. America's always had them. You've had Reagan, you've had Trump, obviously. I'm just struck by the number of, particularly on single issue causes, where there's a particular law associated with them, that we're just seeing in the fray. And by the way, it's on left and right, so it's not like it's not skewed in any way. That celebrities are, we don't scoff at them necessarily in the same way when they have these political interventions. So we've obviously had Esther Ranson on assisted dying.
Yeah.
We've had Jeremy Clarkson, who basically was the spokesperson for what I call the Barber Army. You know, these guys representing the farmers. You know, going back, we had Marcus Rashford as well, very successfully intervening at quite
free
rapid
school
pace
meals, yeah.
on free school meals. And then, you know, the list goes on. And, you know, those of you remember during the 2010 years, I remember Nick Clegg and David Cameron with Joanna Lumley about the issue of the Gurkhas, and that was a bit of I remember there was a photo that someone took of the two of them marching. I remember that became a bit of a predecessor behind their kind of famed chemistry, that were the conditions under which the
And you
coalition
had
government was
Hugh
formed.
Grant on the phone hacking
Exactly,
scandal as well. He got very involved with that.
And I find that interesting because obviously being a celebrity is entertainment. You'd have thought that that's a totally different thing to like the science and the art of governance. But it's interesting that the public are basically seeing a bit more kind of transmissibility between the two. Like, you know, you're speaking to my good friend Luke Trill of More in Common. You know, he had some really interesting polling out recently on a rival podcast that we won't name. They surveyed whether Martin Lewis and Jeremy Clarkson, you know, would they prefer either one of those versus the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition? So, in other words, it was a question that went beyond asking, you know, do you like this person? You know, that doesn't mean that you would think that person can be Prime Minister. Like, you know, I like Joe Root, the England cricketer. Do I think he should be Prime Minister? No idea. He's only ever spoken about batting. But it was interesting that the public, when they were asked about these two characters, Martin Lewis, who is kind of codes as a kind of technical Liberal Democrat with a heart, and then Jeremy Clarkson, who codes as a kind of Conservative, basically, that both of them were more popular, and substantially so. Martin Lewis by a massive majority, Jeremy Clarkson still by a fairly substantial majority, for the job of Prime Minister. And I thought, oh, that's quite interesting.
And it is interesting because I guess what you're saying is that when it's almost like a single issue cause that a celebrity gets behind, there is an authenticity there. Oh, they must really care about this issue. And in the
Exactly.
case of Marcus Rashford, you know, he had been in receipt of free school meals. Hugh Grant was the victim of the hacking scandal. Joanna Lumley, I think, did have a veteran family that had been supported by the Gurkhas. But when we look over to the US, Harris was no shortage of celebrity endorsements with her campaign, Taylor Swift being perhaps the most famous, but Beyoncé and others, and it didn't help at all. So perhaps it's, if you sort of generically get involved with saying, hey, vote for this person, voters like, well, you're just a singer, what do you know about my life? Whereas if it's about something very specific, the authenticity point actually does pique attention and get support for whatever that campaign is.
Well, the other way of reading it is maybe those cast of characters, you know, maybe Taylor Swift would be impactful if she actually stood, but
Put your
she's
money where
not.
your mouth is.
She's kind of getting a bit of a free ride here. And same with Beyonce. And I think also celebrities in the big difference between the US and the UK is that celebrities almost unilaterally code, Hollywood in particular, Democrat over there. So the skew of famous people, the cast of characters, it's like 90-10. You know, you see these really interesting articles about, oh, we found a Republican actor, and every year it's Clint Eastwood, and it's like, okay, thanks guys.
Arnie.
We knew about that before. Interestingly, the UK, you don't quite have the same skew. It's not the same. It's our kind of public figures are A, less polarizing, B, less political, and C, far more open to change their mind. Like Rod Stewart, I remember in the election saying, oh, he was going to vote Labour, he's a lifelong Conservative, he'll probably flip back. No one has a problem with that. So I think, yeah, it is about the authenticity and specificity, but it's also in the US, it's a bit different. A, because most of the celebrities code Democrat almost unilaterally, but B, we've already got a celebrity who is running. That's the president. Like the to-be president-elect Donald Trump. He wouldn't have been president, I don't think, without The Apprentice as a show.
How many of these trends from 2024 do you think are going to carry through into 2025? And are you expecting anything different to emerge as we go into the new year?
We're not going to have as many elections, right? So all these trends aren't going to crystallize in a single moment in an election where you can then validate them. The thing that I'm seeing ahead in 2025 is a political science theory that I definitely did not name and is incredibly uncatchy. It's basically it's called thermostatic kind of political movements. So what does that even mean? It's not about your heating. It's about this idea basically that public opinion moves in the opposite direction of whoever's in charge. So if you've got a Conservative government, everyone gets more left-wing and people switch their vote to the left in aggregate. If there's a Labour government in charge now, the public will shift to the right, not just in terms of their values, but in terms of their voting intention. I think I've done a bit of analysis, and I've recently set up a Substack full of unreadable work that's quite technical.
It won't be unreadable to our incredibly intelligent listeners.
Well,
So,
I've seen your questioners, and they're quite nerdy.
well, why don't you share the link with me afterwards, and listeners will pop it in the show notes, and then you can go and subscribe to James's Substack.
Oh, brilliant! It's called the Political Whiteboard. Political because I talk about politics. Whiteboard because that's what Naomi, we've worked together. You've seen what I do at work. Just
Listeners, the meme of the guy with the whiteboard and he's drawing all the arrows and he's like looking for it. That is most of my meetings with James, where he's like, Naomi, why can't you understand this?
The thing that really struck me in my first post is about the thermostatic change, which is it's speeding up. So I expect in the UK underlying public sentiment on issues to move drastically to the right over the next year. And by that, I mean not just on social issues or immigration, that's kind of already happened. It's actually on the economy. I remember writing the opposite piece in 2017, where I wrote a very catchy pamphlet that absolutely nobody read about how left-wing the public were on economics. I was like, I basically was like, I'm not sure policymakers understand the scale of social democrat opinion in this country back in 2017. Like, this is the context in which Jeremy Corbyn became a thing. Yes, it was about, him having a catchy name that you could sing to a White Stripes song, but it was also that the public were in basically support for full-scale nationalisation across the majority of industries. They basically thought that taxes should go up. They basically wanted redistribution across the piece. They wanted the rich to be squeezed in quite not just on the left, across the right. I think that we are now slightly heading into the inverse of that. So I would expect some pretty big shifts, particularly on like tax and spend. And what does that mean? I don't think that will necessarily translate into a big Conservative lead over Labour over the next. But what I would expect is that the aggregate Conservative reform vote to balloon from where it was before, which was, I don't know, what the Conservatives were at 24%, UKIP at 14% collectively at the July 2024 election. I kind of expect that to go
UKIP.
Reform. Yeah, they keep on changing their name. It's quite hard. I would expect that to go from like 38 to over 50 to 55, basically, over the next couple of years, which is a huge shift. And I also expect the opposite to happen in other countries where there's a right-wing government in charge. And this is kind of what we're going back to, which is these kind of really accelerated political cycles. By the way, I don't think this is a good thing that you elect governments and they basically instantaneously collapse.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a good thing. Like, governments should have the time and the political space to be able to execute what they think is their vision in order to produce growth. It's getting quite ungovernable in terms of a situation where the public are consistently losing trust at rapid pace.
Yeah.
They will look elsewhere. Again, this is seeming like a very optimistic set of trends. Do you know what I think is also interesting for the future trend that I see happening this year, which is around, there's an interesting group of people around this thing, kind of, are they a think tank? I don't know what to call them. Works in progress. You should get them on. They call themselves an incubator. They're much cooler than I am. They all wear T-shirts and trainers, and I think they're based in kind of East London, and it's basically an incubator or a think tank that's funded by the Collison brothers, who are the Strike brothers, right? Who founded, and they don't really sit anywhere on the political spectrum, left or right. And they have various people from various parties. What they are all about is delivery and growth, but at a really, really incremental level. So they're about detailing all of the problems with the UK at a very detailed, so what are our energy problems, what are our infrastructure problems, what are our housing problems? And a lot of people disagree with their thesis, but they've basically distilled, and they've written a paper called Foundations, which you should link to your listeners, and many of them would have read it already. It's basically like, it's really optimistic. It's basically like, we don't have to be poor in the UK. We can make great choices and deliver growth, and we can be a successful, thriving, rich country again if we do these things. Now, are they right? I don't know. It's an untested thesis yet. This group of young men and women are not in charge. They're sat in a building in East London. But for me, that was a real injection of clarity and optimism. And I think that a lot of people will be paying attention to them over the next couple of years. So the third thing I think that's cropping up is the rise of single issue campaigns. So why? Because they have a lot of intellectual and communication clarity. They kind of know exactly what they're doing. They know the change that they want. And we've seen this across the political cycle, but I think this is going to speed up. And I think that governments, the opposition, are going to have to be ready for a whole raft of basically special interest causes coming in with much more clearer, well-defined asks and campaigns.
Especially the pro-European ones like mine.
Especially those, Naomi, and your
Right,
listeners.
James, we need to crack on with questions from our brilliant
Let's do it.
listeners. There were quite a few around this theme, so I'm not going to say that any one listener asked this. It's a general question about what can and is the polling industry doing to improve accuracy. Within that, there was a question about, is there a fear amongst pollsters for being an outlier, and do they herd a bit when they're not totally believing the data that they've collected, and don't want to kind of be cast aside as the ones that called it so wrong, meaning that there's a bit of groupthink happening within the industry?
Yeah, a good question and a fair set of questions given the polling error. So what are pollsters doing? Well, they're doing three things. The first, and by far and away the most important thing, is looking at their samples. So when polling goes wrong, it's almost always because you're speaking to the wrong people. And that can be a function of something called non-response bias, which is interviewing people who don't want to be interviewed, basically. And they can be of different stripes. They can have different economic and political beliefs. They don't necessarily sit on the left or the right. But understanding who they are and spending money to reach out to them is important. And that's the first thing they'll be doing. In the 2015, when there was a UK polling error, and in 2017, that was the clear problem. And the 2024 election in the UK, we can talk about that briefly, because that was both correct and wrong at the same time, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
So the second thing pollsters need to do is get better on communication. So instead of saying X is definitely going to happen, or allowing people to report things as fact instead of a probability or a spectrum of outcomes, that's unhelpful, because people are given a level of false certainty that basically doesn't exist. And I think it's really critical that they do that with their commercial partners and their media partners, and we're all going to have to get better at doing this. And then the third aspect, I think, where pollsters are going to really look to improve is potentially using multiple methodologies to show, as it were, the range of outcomes if you change your assumptions. In other words, taking the engine and flipping it so it's transparent. And that carries with it a massive amount of risk, because basically, if someone comes to you and they're like, what's going to happen? The normal thing to do is to give them an answer, not to show them a 10-slide PowerPoint with like 8 models, right? But the reality is that's more helpful for learning and for polling, which is an art and a science, because we can know what's right and we can know what's wrong and we can work out where we can improve. So I think for me, that's the three things that pollsters should do.
Alice asked a related question, and that was, how do you manage people forgetting or even lying about how they voted previously when answering a survey? So, for example, polling cross breaks often includes splitting out the answer to a question by whether people voted leave or remain. But that is, knocking on for a decade ago
Yeah.
now. And presumably, if you're then weighting your MRP model based on some of those responses, and they might not be right, how do you go about, like, almost verifying whether somebody did or didn't vote that way? Or similarly, handling self-identification, if somebody says they have a certain education level or are from a particular ethnic group or have a certain housing tenure, how much can you believe what they're telling you in the input data?
It's getting very inside baseball here, which I love.
They love it, I
So
promise.
first of all, false recall is a problem, but it is the one that expands with time. So we kind of got lucky with so many frequent elections because basically you were able to pass vote weight to something that really only just happened. And really, when you have a long period of time, like we did between 2019 and 2024, that becomes a problem because basically people forget that they voted, how they voted, who they voted for, whether they did vote. The key thing is to keep the records and to understand that to the degree that you can. But then, of course, you've got the even bigger problem, in my view, Alice, which is around people who didn't vote last time. Like, where do they sit? How is that modelled in?
Yeah.
What do we think about this
Yeah.
group of people? You can begin to see why there are so many challenges. Like, fundamentally, the people who didn't vote in the 2024 US election were way more Republican than people in the prior election than people considered. I mean, one thing that will keep Democrats up at night is that non-voters look a lot more like Republicans than they do like Democrats, which means that Democrats are really well placed for these slightly low turnout elections, like midterms, for example. So,
Yeah.
and these kind of special elections and all these other things. And then they're pretty disadvantaged at the kind of for the national federal election, because every time turnout goes up and you've got a bigger electorate, you've got all these occasional voters and they just look way more not Republican as a political identity, but just in terms of their values, what they want out of life. And so that's going to be keeping them up at night. But to return to your question, Alice, it's about recording it. In terms of, it's also about verifying and triangulating, if we're going to get very inside baseball here. So, like, if someone says that they are X, they're also giving you other pieces of information. So you can begin to work out the probability that they're lying, basically. And you can spot
Right.
all of these trends and patterns about whether that someone is likely to not be telling the truth or not. But fundamentally, people not telling the truth is not the primary source of error with polls. It's that the right people were never spoken to in the first place. It's not this kind of shy Tory, shy Republican thing. It's not really a thing. There's no real evidence for that at all. It's that you weren't able, there's not shy, it's just that they're missing. And
And
that's
how on earth do panels find people that don't want to be found?
yeah, and it's not like telephone polling either can find them as well. And it's going to be a continued challenge over the next 5 to 10 years. Polling errors in general skew massively to the right. If this was randomly distributed, then, if there was many errors on the left as right, I think we'd be all right, because eventually it would kind of come out in the wash, but it isn't. And I think that's just going to take more time and more effort. But there's a slight problem here, which is a bit of a free rider problem, which is maybe it's time for pollsters to put up the paywalls like the media do. Like, at the minute, in a general election, everyone consumes all of these models for free. Millions of pounds of information freely given to people
I pay for them.
to help you.
Just
You do. You pay. You pay, and you pay well.
and you need to appreciate that, listeners.
Yeah, but it's a massive free rider problem, right? Because you've got
Yeah. Yeah.
all of this data basically being interpreted not that correctly for free by people who then complain that it wasn't perfect enough. Would that happen in any other industry? You get given a car for free, doesn't quite meet your specifications and doesn't quite work how you want it to, and doesn't drive you to the destination you want. Well, it's a bit like, well, that's not a particularly good model. So, but of course, once you know a fact, you can't unknow it.
Tom has got a question about the difference between nowcasting and forecasting, and what the value of one is over the other?
Tom, it's an amazing question. I have a feeling, Naomi, are all these people just you? Have you just made up all these people?
I promise they're not. I promise they're not.
It's just like this. All of the listeners of the podcast all work at polling companies. This is my favourite question. And the key to ask yourself is the value to whom. So if you are a buyer of polling, you want the nowcast and the forecast. You want the forecast because it's a long-term thing and you kind of want to know where we're headed. But you also want to know what the impact is today. Why? Because you consistently have challenges and you might have by-elections, you might have local elections. Current opinion can crystallize in a way that has a real-life political impact. The reality is, though, that most forecasting should be a forecast. Nowcasts are of limited use. They do provide a data
And just
set.
explain the difference between them for a listener.
So, like, a nowcast is basically saying, how are you going to vote? And someone says, I'm going to vote like this, and then you just report it. And it's taking a view that they may change their mind, but you don't know how, and you don't know where, and you don't know when. And you report that, and you extrapolate that, and you say, and that's what Parliament would look like, given that. A forecast, which is not necessarily driven just by voting intention, seeks to bake in known or kind of hypotheses about, political science hypotheses that basically seek to treat the data and model it and use other sources to basically say, knowing what we know, this is where we think we're headed. So a lot of people would say, oh, why not just the forecast? Well, technically, if everyone was just forecasting all the time, the forecast would change a lot less than the nowcasts, which are way more volatile. But that would mean that's a huge risk. 5 years out, just being like, well, I kind of know what I think is going to happen based on these prior set of rules, so I'm just going to bake it in. But it is interesting that, long form forecasts can have a huge amount of benefit versus these consistent nowcasts that pop up. The Red Wall thesis, I guess to return it, was a forecast. It wasn't a nowcast. There wasn't a single bit of polling data that went into that identification. The British firm JL Partners was successful at calling the Trump election. I don't think that was a full voting intention model. I think they had other things flowing through it. But that's the problem with forecasts.
Yeah, and when we talked to Luke, we talked to him about the amount of qualitative work that More in Common do that complements their quant and probably help them get to a more accurate prediction in July than some other polling companies.
Exactly. So, at the end of the day, there were basically, someone's gonna get upset here. There were 4 firms that broadly had the right picture from an MRP perspective. Well, not the right picture. Lots of people had the right picture. Everyone had the right picture, which was a Labour victory. But it's interesting, if you take More in Common, JL Partners, YouGov, and Focaldata, it's very interesting that all 4 firms do a lot of work outside MRP, doing qual. And I found it very interesting that they all basically had a very high hit rate on the correct number of seats that were called. More in Common do a lot of qual. We do a lot of AI qual. JL Partners do a lot of qual. YouGov have a massive background in doing also automated qual as well. And I thought that was just really interesting because there were clearly baked in priors all around the piece. And in many ways, those models were less naked. They had a lot more going on behind them. But the problem there with the forecast is potentially the lack of transparency. How much can it be replicated? Whereas the nowcasts are very transparent, right? Everyone can understand exactly what's gone on.
What that means.
And so, I don't know, was this another made up name? Was this Alice or John?
No, the nowcasting versus forecasting was Tom. Tom is not a made up person, I can assure you.
Tom. Fundamentally, Tom's question isn't going to be answered because they both have benefits.
Have different value, yeah. All right, Neil, who is definitely one of our Ko-Fi backers. And by the way, if you're listening to this and you're on Blue Sky, we have a Blue Sky starter pack for lots of quiet rioters who are adding themselves to it so that the community can follow each other and talk about the things that they are interested in. Neil asks, James, is there any point in polling when the margin of error is greater than the difference between the choices? And he has picked out both the EU referendum 52-48 in 2016 and the US election in 2024.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So first of all, in a binary election where that's much more likely to be the case, that's a fair challenge. But in a multi-party system, it's pretty useful to know the order of parties and the way that they interact with each other. Look, it's a provocative question and it's a good one. And I'll give you 3 reasons why I think it's still useful, basically. Number one, you want to know why people voted. So polling isn't just about forecasting. If you're a consumer of polling, you might want to shape the outcome that you're polling. Or if you're polling for a post-mortem, you want to know why it happened for diagnostics. So on both of those accounts, it's extremely useful. Secondly, you want to understand change. So it's useful to know the right result and what the true level is. It's also incredibly important to understand if something has changed, if the political reality has changed, like what are voters responding to? That matters. That's real information that the public deserve to know. And that's also why polling, even if it's the margin of error is bigger than the end result, that's why it's important. Because it holds people accountable. It creates transparency of information. I think the third reason I think that we still poll, even where we're headed to close to 50-50 outcomes and everyone's angry that you can't guess which way the coin will land, is that basically imagine a world where we didn't do this. What is the information that you would be basing your priors on? Imagine a world where only the rich and the powerful had privileged information and access to
insider
that,
trading.
and then basically everyone else was kind of slightly stabbing in the dark. Now, I think the reality is that the coverage of polls needs to change. Like, there's way too much commentary on, like, I think X will happen, and that's it. I think, as I said at the beginning of the answer to Neil, it's like polling is really interesting for understanding the underlying trends, the shifts. Like, why is something happening? What can we explain why this is different to what happened 4 years previously? What's the geographic pattern? What's the variation? What's the distribution? What's changed? And I think being able to, because it's easy to write a story that a party was powerful and now it's about to be made rubble. Like, that makes for great copy, but that's not polling's strongest use.
James, one final question that I'm personally really interested in, and actually you kind of touched on it right at the top of the show when you were talking about the Liberal Democrats, and it's about religion. And Sheena wants to know how much religious affiliation or lack of faith tracks voter attitudes on issues, policies, voting intention. And the reason I mention the Lib Dems is because there is some school of thought, particularly within older liberals, that the party did very well in the non-conformist Protestant areas of the UK, like Devon and Cornwall, like the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, and that there was something about that anti-establishment faith that was not part of the state Church of England,
Yeah.
that meant that the Liberals and subsequently the Lib Dems were the alternative to the Conservatives. And so I'm just really fascinated. I know you've done a lot of work on race and ethnic identity and the the fragmentation of the vote there, and that minority groups aren't just doggedly following the left. I wonder if religion still plays a part.
It does. This is an amazing question. Let's take the Liberals. The Liberal vote, and let's not talk about the Liberal Democrats, has for years had trace elements of the non-conformist Methodist tradition, right? All of the areas that have been strong in the West Country, East Anglia, Highlands and Islands. These are areas of non-conformism, people who are willing to go against the grain, to be liberal, to choose freedom, to not necessarily side along the interests of capital or labour. It's a very, very distinct tradition, and the Liberal vote has for centuries traced that. And in many ways, the Liberal Democrat coalition will always hark back to that when it does well, but it's being stretched basically in the opposite direction, which is that many of the people who now will consider themselves Liberal Democrats will be people who will identify as having no religion at all. That marker tends to co-vary with being white and rich. And therefore, you've got this fundamental tension, I guess, between the kind of Waterloo train Lib Dems, who all wear very smart jackets and do smart jobs with live in smart houses and will, probably not
Drive a
be
smart Tesla.
smart Tesla and not be ostentatiously religious. And then you've got the people more, I guess, in the tradition of Tim Farron, right? And this is like a fundamental tension in liberal thought. Every single party has this tension. I find the liberal one really interesting. And I think at the geographic level, the Liberal Democrats still have this strength in non-conformist England and Wales and Scotland. But at the individual level, it's going to be in the future predominantly more atheist or people of not religion fueling it. So that's a bit of a paradox, I think, that we've seen in the data and definitely the stories that come out of the Lib Dems. I guess from the conservative perspective, let's take the UK and the US. It's very interesting, the de-alignment of people who from typically Protestant areas versus Catholic areas, or it's less of a dynamic in England. It's obviously much more of a dynamic in Scotland and obviously Northern Ireland. But I found in general that the Church of England is not the Conservative Party at prayer. Like that's definitely not.
As was so often framed as being Church of England Tory party at prayer for decades.
No, and it's very interesting to me, just the number of high-ranking, influential Conservatives that are now Catholic. That's kind of happened. It's always been there, but it's quite present now. And I think that's really interesting. And by the way, that's very much replicated in America, where Harris did really badly amongst Catholics. Like, if you're thinking about one of the many reasons that, and I was at the Democratic National Convention. I was there for 4 days, and I was there because we've been there as guests of certain members of the Democrat Party. And I remember thinking, this is pretty hostile territory if you're religious. This is pretty hostile territory. And I think it was Senator Raphael Warnock, I think that's his name. And he's a reverend. He kind of got up in the middle of proceedings and gave a speech. And I remember thinking how out of kilter it had been with the rest of the convention. And that's a new thing, because the Democrat Party for decades has been a party very comfortable, particularly with its black evangelical tradition, but Catholics. That's what do you think Joe Biden was elected on, right? What do you think?
And obviously we saw the Latino vote, which tends to be very Catholic, move away from Harris.
Yeah, and I think the Democrat Party is going to have to get comfortable with religion again to win, particularly amongst those groups that are there. But of course, society's rapidly diversifying. There's lots of people who are not religious.
And irreligiosity is increasing quite rapidly in the USA.
Exactly, and it has massively so in the UK as well. The recent census was very, very clear on that. But it's funny, isn't it? Like, society gets more secular, but suddenly religion is back in play. And there's obviously the issue that Labour's had with voters over Gaza, over Muslim heritage. No one had Harrow East as the safest Conservative seat in the country, which is majority Hindu. The issue, Leicester East flipping. Canada, by the way, you're going to see very similar trends. So for me, it's a great question. Obviously, Quiet Riot is really are really close to the data and the story. So yeah, it's been great talking to you. Well,
that's because they listen to Poll the Other One on the regular, which is the title of this series within the Quiet Riot family. James, we've talked for too long, but also not long enough, because I could listen to you all day long. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. Do come back on the show again very soon. And in the meantime, have a wonderful Christmas break.
Same to you, Naomi. Happy Christmas to you and your listeners. Bye.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this part 2 episode of Poll the Other One Christmas special with James Kanagasooriam as much as you enjoyed the one with Luke Trill. I certainly did. I feel what James doesn't know about polling probably isn't worth knowing. That was such a rich conversation. And I think the stuff that he talked about in terms of public attitudes really made me think of issues I'd not previously considered, particularly everything he mentioned around culture-nomics. He did talk about his Substack and a couple of other projects, so we'll leave links in the show notes to the various things he mentioned. Do make sure that you're following him and Luke on Blue Sky. At Best for Britain, we've got a very juicy MRP poll going into the field in the new year, and I'm going to be sure to record a full readout of the results on another Poll the Other One as soon as they're published. But there might be something we haven't covered today that you're burning to have answered. So if you head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod, you can sign up as a monthly backer and then receive an invite to our next Ask Us Anything event, where you can put the questions to me live online. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to sign off now, but not before I wish you all a very happy new year. Bye. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alexandreo and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Singita. Artwork by Simona Canellu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global. Bye. Right. Okay, I'm going to hit stop and you're going to keep your... No!